When Henry VIII died, he left England a very different place to when he came onto the throne. Throughout his reign, he had changed religion to a huge extent, and he had also executed 70,000 people inside of his kingdom. Even two of his wives, Boleyn and Catherine Howard, were taken to the execution scaffold inside of the Tower of London. Henry VIII, when he died on the 28th of January 1547, had left specific instructions that he should be buried inside of St. George's Chapel within the walls of Windsor Castle. He wanted to be laid to rest with Jane Seymour here for a number of years whilst a huge tomb was created for him, presumably to be placed inside of Westminster Abbey, where he and Jane would have then been moved inside of. But this never happened, and still today, 500 years later, Henry VIII is buried inside of the same vault where he was initially laid to rest. But inside of this vault, someone tried to steal some of Henry VIII's bones. But what happened with the theft of Henry VIII's remains? Now, after his death, Henry VIII was embalmed by royal doctors, and they removed his vital organs, as was traditional for monarchs and members of the royal family. His body was wrapped in a cerecloth and a heavy wax-dipped cloth which covered his remains, but after this he was placed inside of a coffin which was known for its size, and he was left to lay in state before the funeral procession began to take him to Windsor to be buried. The procession was so huge that the streets had to be widened to allow it to pass, and when it stopped inside of Sion Abbey to rest for the night, it was alleged that Henry VIII's body may have exploded due to the movement of the king's remains during the procession. Gases may have built up in the body, and these were then expelled quickly, and it was claimed that some liquid then seeped out of the coffin and onto the floor. However, Henry VIII's coffin had been damaged during this, and there were, over the centuries, a significant amount of damage to this wooden box, as the vault that the king was laid inside of was opened a number of times afterwards. For the execution of King Charles I, the king who lost the English Civil War, Parliament had a dilemma as to what to do with his body, and they wanted to bury him in a location in secret so that his body would not be dug up and then worshipped as if he was a martyr. Because of this, they decided to bury him in the quiet with Henry VIII under the choir of St. George's Chapel, and Charles I's coffin was pushed into this same vault. This was very small, and because of this, Henry VIII's coffin was moved to the side to fit Charles next to him. He was moved directly next to his wife Jane Seymour, and then Charles was placed next to him, and this was shocking, as the executed king was a Stuart, and Henry VIII banned the Stuarts from ever taking the English throne. The burial vault was opened again when a small coffin was placed at the feet of Henry VIII to inter a tragic child of Queen Anne, the last Stuart monarch, who was buried with Henry VIII. But the coffin of Henry VIII was in a bad way, and the exterior wooden shell of it had broken and in places had shattered into many pieces. Inside was the inner lead-lined coffin, which was also noted to have looked as if someone had battered it in a violent fury, as it was very dented. However, when the burial vault was looked at and investigated, it was said that Henry VIII's skeletal remains and also his skull could be seen through holes in the coffin that had been made. The skull even had some traces and hairs from his head still on, and these had been exposed to the air inside of the vault. Henry's coffin was in a bad way when compared with Jane Seymour's, his third wife's coffin, who looked as if it had been buried yesterday and not hundreds of years ago. There was no record made to repair Henry VIII's coffin, despite it being well known about in royal circles that his remains had been exposed to the air, and still today there is a good chance that this is still the case. Thousands of tourists a day walk just inches above the vault and the exposed remains of the most notorious King of England. However, there was one attempt to steal the remains and the bones of King Henry VIII, and this was partly foiled but a foot soldier did manage to remove the remains of the Tudor king and take them out of the coffin and burial vault. One record of this event claimed that the sexton did his best to clear the chapel. Nevertheless, Isaac the sexton's man said that a foot soldier had hid himself so as he was not discerned, and being greedy of prey crept into the vault and cut so much of the velvet pall that covered the great body as he judged would hardly be missed, and wimpled also a hole through the said coffin that was largest, probably fancying that there was something well worth his adventure. The section of his opening the door emptied the sacrilegious person, who being searched, a bone was found on him, which he said he would haft a knife. The governor, being thereof informed of, gave him his reward, and the lords and other presents were convinced that a real body was in the great coffin, which some before had scrupled. With this, a foot soldier noticed that the coffin of Henry VIII, which was huge and described as great, had a number of holes inside of it. The foot soldier then made his own hole in the rotting coffin, and he then reached into this and removed the bones of Henry VIII. He wished to use the bones of Henry to make a knife handle, but when this was discovered, the bone was returned back into the coffin, and the last time this was opened was in the late 19th century. The vault was explored this time by Sir Henry Howard, and he looked at the body of Henry VIII through the holes in the coffin, but he was more focused on searching for the body of King Charles I. But today, the coffin of Henry VIII, it's believed, is still very damaged, and despite the bones being taken from his coffin, they were returned shortly after. Thank you for watching, and to support, please subscribe to Her Remarkable History. Thank you.